Good to go. Hi, everybody. My name is Akhil from Stop LAPD Spying. This is our second Tuesday meeting of the month, each month, and this one is devoted to our fight against the war on youth, which is the term that we are calling our fight against basically all these different federal and local programs that target people, especially youth and their communities, youth of color, under these frameworks of being violent extremists, terrorists, being radicalized, etc., being national security threats, in other words. So just so everybody knows, this meeting is being recorded and it will be on YouTube and on the coalition's social media website. And just if you wanted to like judge accordingly whether or not you want to like change your name in the chat or have your video on or off. Right now, as we start the meeting, the chat is to the hosts only, but we will open it up to be for everybody when we, about halfway, we just have had a lot of trolls, Zoom trolls, especially in the War on Youth meetings. So we wanted to kind of like, this is just part of trying to keep everybody safe. And, but at any point, if you want to, you can definitely raise your hand or message a host if you want to be unmuted, and therefore you can, give your input or ask a question. But then around halfway, when we do more interactive activities, we'll unmute for everybody, or we'll allow everybody to use the chat and make it a little more interactive. Today, we have a very, very special guest. So this is Fatima from Muslim Justice League out in Boston and Cambridge in Massachusetts. Fatima is the executive director of Muslim Justice League, where she leads MJL's efforts to dismantle the criminalization and policing of marginalized communities under national security pretexts. She joined as deputy director in 2017 and increased MJL's focus on organizing within and collaborating across impacted communities to resist and subvert surveillance. That included growing the Building Muslim Power Collective, a group that shifts power through creative actions. Fatima also leads the National Stop CVE network and spearheads MJL's research and is a leader in the donor advised funds campaign of the Public Good Coalition. Fatima serves on the board of directors for Political Research Associates, a social justice think tank devoted to supporting movements that are building a more just and inclusive democratic society. She is also a Boston Democratic Fellow at the Boston Foundation. Fatima previously organized in North Carolina with Muslims for Social Justice, the American Friends Service Committee, and the Stop CVE at UNC campaign. Before that, she was a biomedical engineer and a project manager focused on healthcare systems integration. Wow, amazing. Fatima, welcome. Thank you so much for joining. And Fatima is here to speak a little bit about the campaign against CVE and Homeland Security, including the successful recent wins of MJL targeting the Fusion Center in the Boston area. So I think you should be spotlighted for everyone. So Fatima, take it away. Thank you so much.
Awesome, thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you all. Wow, I also forgot everything that was in my bio, so thank you for naming all of that. And yeah, longtime friend of Stop LAPD Spying. So really just grateful for the work of this group and happy to share, what we've been doing around this Fusion Center. So I'll give some context and then I'll share, what we did recently with the campaign. And yeah, very much open to questions. I love talking about this, so please do feel free to, ask questions as we go along. So a lot of this started actually about 4 years ago. Boston has its own fusion center. So most states have a state level fusion center. And then there are these other fusion centers called like recognized fusion centers, which are either like city or regional level, that are in addition to the state level fusion centers. And so Boston has one of these, in addition to the Massachusetts level fusion center. And about 4 years ago, we knew that, or we saw that Boston Regional Intelligence Center, which is the fusion center, was actually administering the gang database for the Boston Police Department. So it's a unique situation where our fusion center actually sits within the Boston Police Department, both like literally and structurally. It serves as the intelligence department for BPD. And so they are actually the ones who administer the gang database. They have however many analysts that are running the gang database. And then they also have something called the Real-Time Crime Center, which we've learned more about recently. But 4 years ago, we started hearing from immigration attorneys in particular that some young people were essentially about to be deported or were being detained by ICE because of gang database allegations. So this was coming out, much further down the path, during court proceedings, maybe an attorney would see a document that would reference something about this young person being a gang associate or a gang member. And so a bunch of organizations started, talking about this and trying to understand what was actually happening. How is this information, getting to ICE? How are they using it? And the gang database itself uses a 10-point system, which I think a lot of the gang databases in the US use something like a 10-point system or some other kind of point system where quite literally, they just give you points for these, really ridiculous things, including any other officer saying that you're a gang member gets you like 8 or 9 points. So you're already, pretty close to hitting 10 points if a cop just calls you a gang member. And you only need 6 points to be called a gang associate and be entered into the database, which is honestly quite easy for a lot of young people in certain Boston neighborhoods that are predominantly Black and Brown to have that happen. Boston is a extremely segregated city. If you haven't been here, when I moved here, I also thought of Boston as a very white city, and I think that's how it's, portrayed. But in reality, it's actually a majority minority city. It's majority people of color, but it is so segregated that, in national media, what you see of Boston is like these white neighborhoods. But there are a lot of neighborhoods that are, predominantly Black and Brown folks. And so just, knowing certain people, right, wearing certain clothes, all of these other ridiculous things on the 10-point list can easily get a young person or really just any Black or Brown man added to this gang database. So there was one significant case that really got a lot of attention for a kid in East Boston. East Boston is like a predominantly immigrant neighborhood, especially like old Italian immigrants, but predominantly like Latinx immigrants and North African immigrants. And so this kid had gotten into some kind of verbal altercation at school, not physical, nothing actually happened. But a cop at that school wrote an incident report about that situation. and referred to this kid as a gang associate or a gang member. That incident report, that cop is a school resource officer, or whatever they want to call them, and their incident reports are part of the Boston Police Department's incident reports as a whole, and all of those incident reports are shared with the Fusion Center, because BRIC, the Fusion Center, is again like the intelligence arm of BPD. And then somehow that report ends up in ICE's hands. And we find this out through the attorney, through like court proceedings and these documents coming out. But this really took off. I think it actually resulted in some changes at Boston Public Schools, not real changes to like structurally, but a lot of pressure on the superintendent at the time, a lot of pressure on the mayor of the city at the time to answer for how this information was actually getting back to ICE. Boston is not just a very segregated city, it's also a very like liberal city. So people here like to think that this is a place that's safe for immigrants, that ICE is somehow like not going to get anybody locally. And of course, people don't understand that the whole point of this Fusion Center is to collect and share information with DHS and with the FBI. So there was also a lot of like media coverage of that story that didn't dig deep enough into like what was happening. But it did actually get a lot of people to know what BRIC was. Suddenly, people were talking about this Fusion Center, whereas, across the country, it's kind of hard to get people to even know that there are Fusion Centers, that they exist and what they do. But it became a really important issue here locally. And that is because, ourselves, Muslim Justice League, talked about it consistently. Student Immigrant Movement talked about it consistently. And Student Immigrant Movement led a campaign to create a policy at Boston Public Schools that would prevent sharing of information with the police. And they fought really hard for that. Boston Public Schools ended up implementing a policy that was not, what Student Immigrant Movement had actually proposed, and then they patted themselves on the back. So that was disappointing. But Student Immigrant Movement just did, so much organizing around that. And so between, MJL, Student Immigrant Movement, and a number of other, really awesome grassroots organizations locally, we've just talked about this all of the time. For MJL, one thing that we've done is in our youth workshops, especially, for youth, for Black and Brown youth in Boston, we actually, do some activities that help them see the parallels between something like the gang database and something like CVE, or countering violent extremism. And so it's really easy in a city that has so many, youth who are criminalized in various ways. It's really easy for them to see like the similarities in how they're being targeted, and to feel like, okay, it's not just me as a Somali youth who's seen this way. Actually, my classmate from El Salvador is facing the same issue, right? And is being seen a certain way, labeled a certain way. And so that was also another really powerful, way between MJL and other organizations to talk with youth directly about this. We've had a number of people, not just young people, but just the full range of ages of people who also suspected that they might be on the gang database based on how they've been harassed by certain officers. And again, predominantly like Black and Brown men. We've gotten data from the Boston Police Department that also clearly shows that. And that was, really helpful to just, confirm the racial disparities that our community knows is happening, but to really show it with numbers has been very helpful. And yeah, having folks talk about, what kind of impact that can have on somebody's life. Often the people who are potentially on the database, cannot be speaking out about it themselves because it is going to wreak more havoc on their lives. We've had young people share like that they really wanted to speak out at a city council hearing, but they were really anxious about how the backlash that they would face, especially when the literal officers that are harassing them are there physically. And so we found ways to have other young people share their testimony, or adults share their testimony and talk about, how they were being impacted by this. And so this conversation just, continued in various ways over the years. And really what kind of took off last year was around, the defund conversations, right? This national moment of reckoning with where we put our money, and how policing, truly affects people, right? So last June, when that moment took off, at MJL, we actually saw that the BRIC, this fusion center, was up for a grant for $850,000. Their budget for BRIC is about $3.6 million. So this is a pretty significant chunk of their budget. And we just mobilized everybody as quickly as possible to testify at this grants hearing. This was unheard of. The way our city council works is when grants come in, they just like rubber stamp them, right? To them, it's money coming in. They're not really questioning why or what it's going to be used for. And there's rarely public testimony at a grants hearing, but we actually had, a ton of people testify. We had thousands of people emailing city council about this. And, people already knew generally about scandals from BRIC, in addition to the gang database and how that had impacted immigrant youth. BRIC had also done social media surveillance back in I think 2014 to 2016. So they were looking for Muslims who are using just regular terms, like any common Muslim terms, like Ummah, it was one of them, which just means community. And they were looking for people using Black Lives Matter. In fact, a former Black city councilor had a Facebook post included in their social media surveillance because he was talking about racism in Boston, unsurprisingly. And so, some of these things were just adding up for people that BRIC did this social media surveillance. BRIC is running this gang database. They're giving information to ICE. BRIC has 750 cameras across the city. And so people really felt so strongly about it and really showed out. And it put so much pressure on city council. And so since last June, the head of the public safety committee within city council, Councillor Andrea Campbell, continued working with us on this. Coming out of that hearing, she was like, there's no way we can move this grant forward when people are advocating against it. And also this fusion center is not giving us any answers. It's so obvious, from what's happened in the community that they are giving information quite clearly to federal law enforcement. But, in every hearing where they get questioned, or anytime counselors are sending them questions, they're really skating around the issue, not giving clear answers about it. no one has any idea, like, how do you find out if you're on the gang database? How do you get off of it? Like, there's just absolutely no transparency, which is not something that MJL cares about. Like, we don't need it to be transparent. But it was just so blatantly bad that a lot of city councilors felt some type of way about it. You know, I think even if it's just because of their egos, you know, not having their questions answered, it definitely worked to our benefit. So we continued, you know, in the past year to talk with city councilors about this, and to just talk with other community organizations too, and start to understand what you know, what we can do around this. We've actually found that there are a ton of organizations, especially legal organizations or people who provide legal services, who want to abolish the gang database and abolish BRIC, because those folks have seen quite directly how it impacts their clients. So over the past year, we've really built up this this amazing coalition who's working to, you know, end the gang database first as a step towards abolishing BRIC. And you know, through those constant conversations and organizing and advocacy, you know, we just really made a case to city council that BRIC does not deserve this $850,000 grant. That grant was supposed to add 6 staff to BRIC, 4 of which would go to the Real-Time Crime Center. So the Real-Time Crime Center it's their spy center. It's where, you know, they have feeds from all of these cameras across the city, probably like ShotSpotter and license plate readers. We're not entirely sure, you know, what all is happening in the Real-Time Crime Center, but we definitely didn't want more people added to it. And yeah, again, I think between our advocacy and BRIC just sort of, you know, fumbling through questions, I think in the past we could see that, you know, the police had never had to actually answer these types of questions. You know, people really took their answers at surface level. But since last year, the other thing that we've done is really push city council to have community members testify at hearings before the police do. So we get to testify as experts and present our analysis, and even ask the police questions or pose questions, which really upset them, which was quite satisfying. In the last hearing that happened about the gang database, the BRIC officers who were there kind of just lost it, because we got to tell our story first. And so that was really powerful. So what that led to after that last hearing that we had, and, you know, all of that narrative building and, you know, community pressure over the past few years, was that grant, Counselor Campbell was going to actually just let it expire, essentially, without bringing it to a vote at city council. Because, you know, according to her, because BRIC had not answered these questions, was not, you know, being transparent. But we kind of got a more satisfying win. A different city councilor like pulled it for a vote himself, which is also like very, very unique, doesn't happen very often. This happened during the city's budget conversation. It was really unexpected, but he pulled it for a vote because he felt strongly that, you know, BRIC deserves that money and we need more cops. But city councilors, you know, denied it, like a surprising majority of them. I think more councilors than I thought would actually voted against it. And again, that is, you know, very much because of the community pressure that happened, you know, not just since last year, but over the past like 4 or 5 years of people learning about the gang database, understanding how it impacts young people, and talking about how, national security and Islamophobia is what created this fusion center and justified it, but now it's impacting, everyone in our community. So we're really just so excited to keep going and to build off of that momentum. The momentum is still there. We have city elections this year. We have a really big election this year because the incumbent mayor left for DC. And so there are a lot of people vying for mayor in Boston. And pretty consistently throughout mayoral forums, city council forums, questionnaires, people are actually asking if these candidates will abolish the gang database or abolish BRIC. And that's not even like, I didn't even have to do that. That's the beauty of where this campaign has gone and how much it's taken off across the city is like, I haven't actually asked people to include that question, but people know that is just one of the most significant policing issues in the city. And so that's been really cool to see a number of candidates commit to it, especially candidates who I didn't think would. And I think clearly we're pressured to take a real stance on it because of this grant, because of the campaign that we've been running. So yeah, we feel just, really, really good about denying them that money, denying them those positions, and excited to keep going, and excited to answer any questions that y'all have about it.
Thank you so much, Fatima. So maybe if you can, so first of all, Fatima's on East Coast time, so really grateful that you're here at 9:30 your time. So everybody, if you could, if there are any questions, to message them to one of the hosts. You can send me a message, or you can send it directly to Fatima in the chat. Maybe while people are typing, could you also briefly touch on a little bit about your anti-CVE organizing, and especially among youth in Boston? Because we know that especially Somali and Black Muslim youth are very targeted in Boston, just like everywhere. But yeah, curious a little bit about how MJL's work has been going with that too, while people are typing their question.
Yeah, that's another place where we had a really great win. It was not as public, partly because of COVID and just, the weirdness of COVID life. But there have been a number of CVE programs happening in Massachusetts. They continue, unfortunately, and they, target Muslims across the board. But we had one specific program that was targeting Somali youth that was just like so egregiously bad, where the idea was that if you, get these Somali youth to hang out with police officers, somehow they'll all get along. But they were asking the kids like questions before and after too about like, would you share information with police officers? Like, are you, doing anything illegal? Are you skipping class? Like just all of these terrible, terrible things that they were asking them. And all of the language, all of the framing of that program was so clearly racist and Islamophobic. So people felt really strongly about that here locally, and I know nationally too, with CVE organizing, that people were really able to identify through that, like what's wrong with this kind of youth police dialogue. And so we consistently organized against it. They ran the program for, I think, like a year and a half, which was their original grant. But we, the whole time, were doing like testimony. So either people would like sign our petition, and then we might share their testimony out on social media, or we'd have people record videos or take pictures where they would talk about what they would do with $500,000 instead of harassing Somali youth. And yeah, through that organizing, talking about it with city councilors and advocating again and again, and just making it such a public conversation, it just became so toxic for the police department that, you know, even though they were like one of the favorite programs of the Department of Homeland Security, and DHS really wanted them to continue the program. They were going to model like other youth programming off of that local program. The Boston Police Department was like, we want nothing to do with this. That was a very, like, again, not public, but we just know through a city councilor who was asking BPD if they were going to continue, and got like a very intense call from the commissioner at the time, who was like, we don't do this anymore. Like, don't worry, we won't do it. We know it's bad. We're out. So, you know, they clearly got the message, even if they didn't want to like concede directly to us that we won. It was still, again, really satisfying to know that that they wouldn't continue that CVE program. And I think that's a win both for us locally and, you know, for CVE nationally, because that was, you know, a program that people felt really strongly about across the country.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That is a really badass win, even if they won't admit it. One quick last question. We got a question from somebody in the chat, which is, how did you find out that the database, and I think they probably mean the gang database, existed, and how did people find out that they were on it?
Yeah, so a lot of this was through attorneys. So one, you know, I think people just kind of knew that the gang database existed, and BRIC did have like a privacy policy that's accessible online, that mentioned like the 10-point system. So that part was actually easy to find. We were able to, you know, find that 10-point chart and see how people would be classified, but nobody knew like who is on it, how many people are on it, like what is actually going on with this. So there were two things that happened. One is that we did public records requests with the ACLU and a number of organizations to just get data about the gang database. That's how we found out that there were like 5,000 people on it, that they were claiming that there's like at least 130 gangs in Boston, which, if you don't know, Boston is not a big city. So like, that is wild to think that there's that many gangs here. And we got, you know, again, some additional data about like gender and race through those public records requests. The other thing that happened was that immigration attorneys in particular were seeing some of these documents come up in proceedings for their clients. So, you know, they would suddenly see a piece of paper or something that had, you know, gang associate or gang member somewhere in it. And it was clear that that was like an incident report from a police officer, or something where this person was labeled, you know, a gang member. So that's been the only way for people to really, really know if they're on the gang database. The attorneys have also been trying to figure out, like, you know, what's a way to do a public records request or some kind of request to confirm that a client is on the database, like rather than waiting until a document just pops up. We have been trying to find a proactive way that we could do that, you know, potentially flood them with requests if possible, for finding out like who's on the database. But a lot of it has been, unfortunately, like when somebody is being heavily impacted. Like we've heard from some attorneys as well that if a client, you know, is being charged really for anything, like not immigration related, that the prosecutors will likely get a call from the DA telling them this person's on the gang database, so like you should do everything, like hit them with absolutely everything. So we know that in court people are severely impacted by this. We know from like social workers who work with public defenders offices that it's having an impact on a lot of people's lives outside of court as well. And so we're trying to navigate too, like how to preemptively find out, like before before it's too late for somebody, right? Before they're literally like getting sent out of the country at like age 16 or 17 for something like this. But we're also really just simultaneously trying hard to delete the database like as quickly as possible. So we've been talking with other folks who either are fighting fusion centers or fighting gang databases to understand like how other campaigns are going and what we could potentially do here in Boston.
That's a really great transition to when we're talking about the Stop LAPD Spying's mutual fight against the Fusion Center here. But one last, hopefully very quick logistical question that came from the chat as well, which is when did the grant, which was for the 6 staff positions, and then the youth program with Somali youth get canceled? Could you just tell everybody what that timeline was?
Yeah, so the grant, they initially reviewed the grant last June, and normally it would have been like approved immediately, but it ended up taking a full year. And so I think it was like June 28th, like the like last minute, the grant was going to expire. So this past June, just a little over a month ago, was when the grant finally got a vote and was denied. And then the Somali youth program, I think it was last fall that we got confirmation that the police were no longer going to do it. Like we weren't sure, what was happening with it. They kept asking, and then we finally got this, this private confirmation that they're no longer going to do it. So it's sort of in the middle of COVID, which is still feels good, and we're hoping to find like ways that we can publicly celebrate some of these wins with our members too in like a COVID safe way.
Fatima, thank you so much, and thank you for sticking around past the time that you said to answer some of the questions from the community members, and just really appreciate you being here. So I know you got to go, so feel free to, and maybe we could take down any other questions to email if people want to, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. Again, I'm such a fan of Stop LAPD Spying. It's so nice to see Nadia and Hamid and friends on here. Y'all are the only group that I would do 9 to 10 p.m. conversations for. And definitely like want to keep hearing about what you all are doing. Celine is always filling me in, and please send any questions my way as well.
Thank you so much, Fatima. We'll be transitioning now to Nadia and Hamid.
All right, thanks y'all. Bye.
Bye. Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Nadia Khan. I'm with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, and it was just really nice to have Fatima on. Hadn't seen her in a minute too. So yeah, shout out to MJL over there, holding it down. So we're just gonna basically transition now. And what we wanted to do was talk about fusion centers in general, how they fit within, and Fatima did definitely talk about it, and we want to talk about how fusion centers fit within the stalker state, which I'll show surveillance, state violence, and then also talk about our own actions we've taken against a local fusion center we have right here in Norwalk, right in LA County, one of the biggest fusion centers in the country, actually. We were able to shut it down, a bunch of youth and a lot of folks. And so, so before, I'm just gonna be asking Hamid some questions, who's on too with the Stop LAPD Spying. Before we go into it, just wanted to quickly show you all the diagram. Let me just share my screen. Give me a sip, sorry. Why is it? Okay, there we go. So this right here is, which I'm sure most of you have seen, is our what we call the stalker state. And it's basically, it's a term the coalition came up with to talk about how the state tracks people, surveils people, and essentially how that in itself is inherently violent. And of course, the different other forms of violence that manifest because of it. And so what we see here is, so we have, it's basically a bunch of Venn diagrams, right? And they all intersect and they all connect. In the middle, we have what we call the LAPD architecture of surveillance. So obviously being in LA, LAPD is the department that we take on. And so this is the various components of how the LAPD engages in surveilling and stalking communities. And so these are the pieces within that, right? We have in the centers, the fusion centers, which is what we've been focusing on today and what we're going to continue to look at as well. And the fusion centers are, again, these mega spy centers where people have, where essentially agencies as
Did Nadia drop off?
Yeah, we may have lost Nadia.
Hamid, do you think you could kind of just like pick up where she left off by any chance?
Yeah, so Nadia was speaking about the stalker state and the fusion center. And fusion centers are basically, oh, there's Nadia. Let's just see. I think Nadia may be having a bad connection. So yeah, so fusion centers are basically these central hub and spoke systems of information gathering and information storing and information sharing. The idea of warehousing of information is nothing new, and fusion centers in sort of different manifestations have existed, but they really became a major piece in the supposedly the intelligence gathering around the war on terror. And this was as an extension of the 2004 bill around the Intelligence Reform Terrorism Prevention Act is when fusion centers became super central about what their role is going to be. So in a sense, think of fusion centers as these major data hubs of everything, all the information that is being gathered on you, which then gets uploaded into these databases. And then the investigation begins, and which is basically what Nadia was trying to explain about the stalker state, is called the information sharing environment. So that's what I'm just looking at my text. So, okay, well, that's Nadia saying, keeps kicking me out. So the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition basically targeted the fusion centers pretty much from the get-go. Back in 2012, we organized a major sort of a protest and a rally, and the idea was to raise awareness in the community as to that these were spy centers amongst their midst. And what's interesting about the Los Angeles fusion centers, and there's about 85, like I said, around the country, and one of the biggest ones is in Norwalk, and there are 6 of them in the state of California. The one in Los Angeles covers 6 counties. It covers Ventura, it covers Los Angeles, it covers San Bernardino, it covers Riverside, it covers Los Angeles. So these are the counties that it covers. And then generally what happens is that the fusion centers are, the way they are funded is that it's primarily a let me just give Nadia the co-host. All right, Nadia. So sorry, Nadia, I started speaking about the fusion centers.
No, all good. Sorry, it just kept kicking me in and out. Go ahead, continue.
Right. So, so the funding is typically from the Department of Homeland Security, and it's a partnership between local and municipal governments. So about plus 75% of the funding typically comes from the state government. And so in Los Angeles, for example, the Fusion Center is co-located with the Social Security Office. It's in the same building. It's in that hub of government offices on Imperial Highway in Norwalk. So we wanted to expose that. And the first action, what happened was that we actually went door knocking in the local community. We went home to home, and it was myself and Jamie and Chella and Nadia. And then we just, raised awareness in the community that there was a spy center there. So which was really cool, because when we had the action coming up and we let them know that we'll be holding a major protest there and we'd love to have them join us. So the folks came out and they were like, whoa, what do you mean? I mean, this is like COINTELPRO. We're like, yeah, of course, that thing has never stopped. But also what happened was that, and this was probably one of the first actions against the fusion centers in the country, that as we were planning this action, we received a letter from the management of these buildings asking us that they had shared this information, that we are going to be having an action with the FBI. And then the FBI is monitoring us, which of course they are the central investigating agency in the Fusion Center. And they wanted to ask what we would be doing. So we were like, well, you'll find out what we're going to be doing. So we just, did this action in 2012. Raised the expose, a lot of youth were there. And then we planned a nationwide action as well in April of 2014, in which at that time, Boston also participated. So, and this was through the Fourth Amendment Center, which was kind of leading this piece in Boston. So there was about 12 cities or so at this time that participated with us. So I can, so I don't know, Nadia, if you have photos, if you want to show, so go ahead. Right. So these are the photo right here. This is the one this is Bilal speaking at the Fusion Center action, and this is the building where the Fusion Center exists to the right. I'm sorry, I'm using my cursor. I don't know. No, the answer to your question, the question is, did the FBI ever try to hurt you? No, they obviously they pulled us out all in a database. And we were there. But this picture is really interesting, the one in the middle where you see this dark picture. This is where you see the employees in that building, because they had locked and put locks outside, inside the doors. And then this was like from the other side of the building, we took this picture because the crowd had gathered and surrounded the Fusion Center. And it was almost like, you know, the natives are restless. They are there, they're going to break it down. And we basically just kind of mobbed the Fusion Center, and that's that photo down there. So it was a pretty intense action, as folks were leading it. Nadia, if you allow me, I can probably show, I just wanted to show this one video as well real quickly, where, well, maybe before I go there, I just wanted to show this. So this was a march that so what we would do is we would go to the local McDonald's or somebody, and because it's in Norwalk, so we had parked a couple buses over there. People came, one bus came from YJC, so there were about 50 youth from YJC. There was a whole bunch of youth that came from Bus Riders Union at the time as well. A lot of Skid Row community joined us. We had planned a street theater. Mariela and other folks organized all of that. So this march, basically, you see, is coming towards the Fusion Center. There was at least a couple of hundred people in this action where folks were out there. And I'll just show one more photo there. Okay, there's the stop share. And just want to open up another picture, which was, yeah, this is, let's see. So when we saw that photo from the inside, this was the one where people were banging on the doors, where they had locked it from the inside, and everybody had mobbed the Fusion Center on this side. And if you think about the going around the building, we had circled the building, and then we had, and our goal was to go inside the building. Our goal was to just go up the stairs and have people out there and just go inside and flood the Fusion Center. But they realized that they had people coming at them. People were banging on the doors, so they basically just closed down. And of course, like when somebody said that if the FBI was on you, FBI was all over the place, and they were like, they had their cameras and they were taking photos. And this is the April 2010 action. But one of the things, and this is why I also wanted to show, was that we wanted to deliver a public records as well, because they were not taking this public record. So we asked some of our white comrades. So, now is the time to carry the water and take it with you. So Jim Lafferty, who was the executive director of the National Lawyers Guild at the time, then went up and along with a couple of people. So I will just share this video. Can people see this video?
Yes, we
Are you able?
can.
You can see that? Sorry, Akhil, did you say yes? You can see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So now this is the Fusion Center.
Why don't you close the door of the government office? I'm just trying to hand a document. So you documents for you. Is there no one in this room who will accept the document? That's all we're trying to do, and then we're out of here.
So he's telling them that here we are trying to deliver a document for public records, and so they're just kind of not letting them inside.
Accept the document. Can you accept the document for service of a document, a Public Record Act request? It's a pretty simple, straightforward matter. State law provides for it. We're not above state law.
Sir, I need to close this.
And I need to keep it open until I hand this document to the person who said it's coming so that I can hand the document to you.
I don't know which person you want to speak to, sir.
I'll speak to anybody. I'm not particular. You're the one who's making this very difficult. I would just like to have somebody come here so that I can hand this document to the person and leave. And for reasons that are totally amazing to me.
Amazing to me too.
You're
also,
first of all, it's a government office. You're claiming it's a private office.
When the seal is right there.
When the seal is right there. You won't tell me your name. I guess you're ashamed of what you do. I had no idea. I've given you my card. I'm very above board on what I'm trying to do. You're acting like some kind of spy in a totalitarian government.
Good orders, close the doors.
By who?
By whom? By whom?
Don't put your hand
Who
up.
have you been over?
Hey, you fucking Nazi, open the fucking door. What's the matter with you?
Don't, sir, interfere with their business.
Here, you're served. You're served, you fucking asshole. You're served, you're served, you're served.
Under whose authority do you lock the door?
So you get the gist that, we ended up, and what had happened was that in our own, community-based recon, about 3 days before this action, Jamie Garcia and I ended up, and we walked into the Fusion Center, and we had already walked in there. And that's when, they were like, well, who are you all? We're like, hey, just checking it out. So they forced us out. And then they called the sheriffs on us, and they asked that we be arrested because it's a federal building and blah, blah, blah. And of course, the FBI was there and Homeland Security was there. But it was interesting that at that time, which was that the sheriffs didn't arrest us. So they basically said that, yo, this is a public building. They're here. And then we kept on saying that, hey, we're just here to deliver some public records request and all of that. And that's what's going on. So fusion centers have a very, messed up history. In the United States, they have been, just around for a long time. But what happened was that in 2012, the U.S. Senate subcommittee released a report on the federal funding of fusion centers. And I'll show you a copy of the actual report, which would be, so let me just go back to that real quickly. That if you were to So this was released on, and we ended up speaking to the main investigators on this. And the main investigator was it was done by Carl Levin, who was a senator from Michigan at the time. And we ended up speaking to Justin Rood about the report and as it came out, and he was super surprised that anybody was even interested in that. He said this is the first time that anybody from the community had actually called him to talk about like this thing. But when you look at just the table of content, I mean, this was a scathing report of the Fusion Center. And if you look at it, it says, it does not generate timely, useful intelligence for federal counterterrorism efforts. Reporting from fusion centers were often flawed, unrelated to terrorism. Some reports had nothing of value and could have violated Privacy Act protections. Was often outdated, duplicative, and uninformative, and just on and on and on. And this was basically around this whole BS of that it didn't adequately oversee its financial support for Fusion Center. They ended up finding out, and it's unable to meaningfully contribute to federal counterterrorism efforts and all of that. So I think the point here I'm trying to make is, and this report is posted on our website as well, that all of this money, when we talk about defunding and when we talk about abolition, I mean, even the federal government, that they were only looking at the federal government side of $1.4 billion up until that time that they had given for the development of Fusion Center, and this is what they came back with. Right. So in essence, it is absolutely critical that we need to keep on fighting and need to keep on exposing. And that's why when we talk about defund police and defund surveillance, especially the defund surveillance campaign that the coalition started along with Free Radicals, that's what we talk about, that what you have here is a complete, and I don't want to use that language, but let's even call it a boondoggle, which is like, just, and even for a second, if we were to go in that mode of counterterrorism intelligence gathering, well, your own people, the oversight people are saying, which is BS to begin with, but they're saying that it is absolutely duplicative, it's outdated, violating Privacy Act protections and things like that. So I'll end by saying that the fusion centers remain a primary target for the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, and we need to really kind of start just mobilizing. And we had plans for continuing action, but COVID kind of just put a damper on things. But we need to circle back and pay another visit to the Fusion Center in Norwalk. So thank you.
Nice. Thank you for for just sharing about that. It's been years, so it's nice to see those photos again and just kind of and really just think about the vibrancy and the energy and really how threatening we are to the state. And I mean that in the sense of just like, especially young people, right? Because I think young people are always really bringing that energy and bringing that vibrancy that we really need. So I think that was that was very present there and continues to be very present. So I do have a question. I wanted to see if anyone else has any questions for Hamid about just fusion centers in general, about the action. I'll go ahead and ask the question I had, and in the meantime, feel free to type it in or anything. But my question is how do you think defunding a fusion center, like this fight, how does it fit within the abolition of the police state?
Well, I mean, the fusion centers are almost like the central nerve system, if you think about it, of intelligence gathering and the information sharing environment. Because everything that we do, there were close to about over 200 different types of databases and all that or programs and platforms that the Fusion Center uses. So it's like I don't know, quintillion or gazillion. I have no idea how many bytes of information is now going into the Fusion Centers. And they operate both on a local level, on a regional level, on a national level, and on an international level as well. The NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, is very much connected to the fusion centers. So when they say that the NSA, the National Security Administration, doesn't spy on people locally here, that is all hogwash, because the NCTC gathers the information, which is then connected to the NSA and other agencies as well. So and now increasingly, with public health surveillance and with COVID, and obviously Palantir is very central to that data processing as well. So I think it's, again, their only function in our lives is to gather information. Their only function in our lives is to process that information and to put that information out there. It is through the fusion centers that the National Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative even functions. It's through the fusion centers that close to about almost 16,000 plus local law enforcement agencies, there's about 18,000 in the country, are connected as a result of the information sharing from the Fusion Center. And then when you bring in, and when when we look at the Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative, you have over 300 Department of Defense agencies that are connected. You have about, and this is a report going back about 10 years, that at that time about 70,000 first responders had already, so even when you call 911, even when you call, so all the information that is being gathered is being uploaded into the databases. So in essence, even if we were to keep it on a very, very mainstream level, the whole, just the chances of getting false positives is very high. So, so that also how somebody can be impacted as well. So, for example, and I'll just want to quickly share one more thing with you all, where, just here is, and this is I'm going to share an actual SAR with you all. So this is a suspicious activity report. Now this goes back 2009. This was by the Sheriff's Department. Now, when you look at this report, they have redacted stuff. And this was in Carson, and it says that so-and-so reported that 4 adult females were taking pictures of the east side of we don't know what, right? And then when the sheriffs contacted the 4 adult females who cooperated and spoke with me, they told me they were for students from Brentwood Art School in the city of Santa Monica. They were just taking pictures as part of a social assignment. So here you have now, once this has gone up, now the SAR, Suspicious Activity Report, has been filed, and then it goes into, people's, it goes into the databases, then it goes to the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and that's where it takes you. Real quickly, I'll share with you another one. Here is the subject was standing at the south end of roadway of Union Station, right here in downtown Los Angeles, adjacent to the tracks, videotaping the Freeway 101 in downtown LA backdrop. I made contact with the above individual. He stated he was making video for Stop the Violence, like a grassroots organization. The individual's return came back without wants. And so now already, just by virtue of doing that, you've got into the databases, and now your investigation has begun. So you're forever kind of like being marked as a way of being as being a suspect body. So I think the funding becomes really critical, to your point, Nadia, when we are talking about fusion centers.
So unfortunately, Nadia dropped off again. So at this point, by the way, the chat is open. So feel free to put in the chat any other questions you might have for Hamid about fusion centers, suspicious activity reports, or the coalition's campaigns against these. While people are typing, I just have like a very basic kind of silly question, Hamid. When you and Jamie just kind of like walked in before the action and, managed to make it inside, what did the building look like on the inside? What was the this spy center like on the inside? Was it relatively nondescript? Did it seem secretive? Has it become more securitized since that action?
Yeah, so one of the things they do is it's almost camouflaged as a within other public sector agencies. So for example, so if you go to Norwalk, which is the Los Angeles County's central sort of like, hub of the Superior Court, and various other court systems are there. You have the main sheriff's office, and then the rest of the stuff. This is on Imperial Highway. So this is co-located in the Social Security Administration's office. So, one of the things in this action, we also had to be very sensitive about this thing, because we didn't want people to be restricted for going into for their Social Security stuff, right? So we had to really kind of just do our own recon, that what are the times, how do people, what are the ways that we can preventing people from going in, to be sensitive to that, but yet at the same time. So we managed to then identify, and we kind of just, first of all, just to talk to folks and say, hey, there's a federal office here. So we just wanted to, we're looking for that. So we found out it's on the 4th floor. So, so just add some of the folks, and then just kind of went up. So it is kind of nondescript, but it is probably one of the most secret kind of location as far as our information is concerned. So definitely it's camouflaged quite a bit in that way.
And then I just have one other question about it too, but first just wanted to check. Also, if you don't prefer to chat but prefer to speak out loud, either feel free to raise your hand, or I think you should be able to unmute right now. So maybe if anybody wants to ask Hamid a question about the fusion centers or the suspicious activity reporting program.
So there's a question here from Steve that where and how does this flow interact with policymakers, or is it generally limited to internal iteration and only pokes out in highly distilled fashion? The objective being to corrupt the information flow. So yeah, Steve, it very much interacts with the foreign policy. It interacts with domestic policy as well, because obviously how people are responding, what is the take on people, where you have Palantir central to data processing, and now increasingly, when you'll have more and more health surveillance going on as a result of COVID, how people are responding to it, how public health even further weaponizes that information as a stalker state. So in essence, this is how the stalker state is further strengthened, and it gained deeper roots into our lives as well. So it definitely informs the policymakers quite a bit.
Awesome. Any other last questions for Hamid about the Fusion Center and the suspicious activity reporting program? Cool, well, we'll move on, but if you think of one, I think Hamid will be here, so you can feel free to interrupt us during our next couple sections if you suddenly think of a question for Hamid about the fusion centers. Just as a quick overview of what the agenda is for the rest of the meeting, here I'm going to share screen briefly, or not so briefly. So we already had the amazing presentation from Fatima and Muslim Justice League, and from Hamid, Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. We're going to move into basically an overview of the new changes to the Department of Homeland Security and, the new changes to the Department of Homeland Security and the new domestic violent extremism classifications that have come out of the Biden administration. And we're going to do an interactive activity on that, as well as look at other changes that are coming out of the FBI and DHS. And then finally bring it home with how is this happening to youth in LA schools? What is the points of connection where youth are coming face to face with federal agencies, or what is more often happening, that their information is ending up in these federal agencies' hands and in the fusion centers through seemingly innocuous programs at their school. So, so that's basically the flow for the next a little bit. So first, before that, I think Paul is just going to talk about the program called CVE, which is really the basis for why we're meeting today. And even though it's a discrete program with a meaning that Paul is going to tell us, it also describes sort of a framework of policing that encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about, even when it doesn't go by that name CVE. So Paul, do you want to tell us a little bit about CVE and why it's harmful?
Yeah, thank you so much, Akhil. So CVE stands for Countering Violent Extremism, and kind of resonant with the conversation about fusion centers and the stalker state and all these multiple connections and intersections between the federal law enforcement intelligence agencies that do all the spying on our communities, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, all of those kind of agencies collude to bring programs like countering violent extremism down from the federal policy level down to these decentralized and into these forms that are trying to be embedded in local institutions of civil society, of local municipal and local public sectors, and just all kinds of different parts of the local community. And the impact of this is, to me, undeniably harmful, in that a lot of what we see happening with these programs, which are touted as initiatives to make our communities safer by bringing together civil society and the public and social service sector and the business sector, is really more about expanding the web of surveillance that has an overwhelmingly negative impact on the most vulnerable and marginalized parts of our community. Very problematic in the attempts to sync up these programs with existing standards of that we have in the public sector, of like mandated reporting. Seeks to kind of expand definitions of what shall be reported on to include surveilling students who are, based on all these white supremacist stereotypes about extremism. It singles those students out as being particularly prone to extremism, quote unquote. And as it says in that final section, it really chills dissent, sows distrust, and creates a culture of suspicion, which drives people in our community who really need access to education services and healthcare. It drives those people away from those kind of public goods, and arguably betrays the mission of a lot of our public goods, and instead uses those to the end of surveillance by federal intelligence agencies. Yeah, do I have the next slide? Yes, the iceberg of countering violent extremism. Gosh, as we've seen with the stalker state, so many aspects of intelligence and surveillance are really intersecting and have this kind of feedback loop from the federal level to the local, municipal level and state level. Yeah, in the iceberg of CVE, we've got what is readily observed from the outside are the surveillance and policing programs that are the kind of public relations campaign around them, and the narrative put out by those agencies and institutions suggests that they're going to suppress hate and extremism, which are very poignant topics and discourses in our society today. There is an enormous amount of extremist violence against against our already marginalized and vulnerable communities. However, these programs aren't, there's not a lot of evidence that they really serve to counter the kind of white supremacist threats that we understand are growing in our society. So in countering violent extremism, it's seeking to join and to introduce programs of surveillance into areas that aren't typically thought of as being areas of policing, and it really, as we've seen with these programs, they tend to stigmatize and cast suspicion on already vulnerable and marginalized members of our community. What we've seen so far in the materials and in the institutions receiving these grants is that many of them are using them to reproduce anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and especially anti-Palestinian narratives. Let's see, several of these agencies or institutions receiving grants, their messaging conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Some of them are really in our perspective, they're really providing public relations services to the police. As Fatima from Muslim Justice League was talking about, that program where they were having, that was on the surface level, the narrative was that they were going to bring Somali Muslim youth together with the police and help them build connections and understanding. And ultimately that was used as an opportunity to try and, inspire youth to inform on one another, or really just to share and divulge potentially incriminating information. Really problematic situation. And one thing that is of a special concern to the coalition is that it's a broader move to create a culture of policing within these public goods, within the public sector, in education, mental health, and in civil society at large, in particularly houses of worship, and those religious spaces. So the primary method by which countering violent extremism has kind of moved and sought influence is through these grants for, that are all phrased in these kind of ways about being preventative and educating communities, creating partnerships with community leaders or local businesses, local schools. But as we understand, there's an insidious side to this. And next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And based on, hearing you talk about that, I also maybe feel like we need to, oops, this is me, flip the iceberg, because actually it seems like what people more see oftentimes is the the ones that look harmless or benign. They're just educating about community. And under the surface is the policing. So I've accidentally kind of done it the other way around. But right now, what we're going to do is we're going to do an interactive activity. So I don't know, Celine, if you're back from the OC meeting. I know you were in 2 meetings at once, but let us know in the chat if you're here. If not, maybe.
Webinar, and then
Oh,
I'm listening, but I'll be like more on in like 5 minutes, so you can start the activity and I'll jump in.
okay, cool. And maybe Fatima, if you're down, we can kind of like facilitate it. But basically the activity is around the new, let me find my slide again. Here we go. It's about the new language that's coming out from the Biden administration about what types of so-called extremists they're looking at, they're trying to surveil. And they call them now DVEs, or domestic violent extremists. So they have these different classifications. Whoops. This came out of the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, a couple months ago, and it was definitely kind of prompted by or inspired by the mob attack at the Capitol in January. However, we can see when we look at their language who they are really thinking about and who they're targeting. So the activity that we had thought of is basically a translation activity. So Fatima, do you want to like describe a little bit about what the activity is, if you're able to?
Yeah, so it's kind of just like seeing what these descriptions of so-called extremists mean to you. For example, we're seeing this category, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. It says DVEs with ideological agendas derived from bias, often related to race or ethnicity, held by the actor against others, including a given population group. So what stands out to me is that both a white supremacist and someone who's fighting against white supremacy could be categorized as an extreme, so-called extremist here. So yeah, what do the other categories mean to folks? How would you translate this from the state's language to what it really is?
Great, so thank you for that example, Fatima. So the way we'll do it then is we'll read out loud a definition, and then we encourage you to put your own translation, what it means to you, in the chat, or you can say it out loud. You can unmute, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute, but I think you should be able to unmute as well. So why don't we start off with that first one that, that Fatima chose. I'll read it out loud one more time, and you should be able to see it in the middle of the screen. It's right here. So it's racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. Again, this is language coming out of the Biden administration of who the Department of Homeland Security will target. DVEs with ideological agendas derived from bias, often related to race or ethnicity, held by the actor against others, including a given population group. So please put your translation in the chat, or your thoughts about it, or you can say it out loud too. Go for Sydney, whatever you want counts, yeah. Oh, that was your translation, Sydney. Sorry, it just clicked to me. Sydney put it, had the comment, do police count? Which is, I think, an insight. Yeah, like, can you imagine the Department of Homeland Security ever classifying a police officer as a DVE, even though we all know that they are extremely racially motivated? So I'll read it out loud one more time for people. DVEs with ideological agendas derived from bias, often related to race or ethnicity, held by the actor against others, including a given population group. Paul says, I heard somewhere recently that police officer is the most common job held by KKK members or among the most common. Wow. Another thing you can put into the chat is what stands out to you about that little blurb. What stands out to you? What seems especially either galling or important? And feel free, if you don't want to type, you can also unmute and speak out loud. Oh, chat isn't enabled for everyone. Okay, now it should be enabled for everyone. I don't know why it wasn't before. Sorry about that, everybody. If people were trying, can people try to type in the chat now and hopefully it'll work now? Okay, awesome. So if you want to put your definition for racially or ethnically, why is it always about race? And something that stood out is derived from bias. And Charles is expanding on that, saying that it's focusing on personal bias over any kind of structural domination. And it's so general, Stephanie is saying, yeah. So it's kind of viewing all quote unquote biases as equal. And also it's not looking at like the racially, or it's only looking at personal and not structural. How many people have to get hurt to constitute bias? Let's move on to another one. And you can, again, put into the chat either what stands out to you about the state's words, the state's language, or you could put it in your own words and do a translation. So let's do the anarchist violent extremists. DVEs who oppose all forms of capitalism, corporate globalization, and governing institutions which are perceived as harmful to society. So we have a comment that says, if I believe we live in a white patriarchal society, does that count as a negative bias? So I'll read it out one more time. Feel free to put in the chat either what stands out to you about it, or you can translate it into your own words. Anarchist violent extremists, DVEs, that's domestic violent extremists, who oppose all forms of capitalism, corporate globalization, and governing institutions, which are perceived as harmful to society. And Sydney's doing a translation. People who disrupt their capitalist venture and culture and therefore hurt our profit margins. Yes, Sydney. can I do a translation of your translation, Sydney?
Yep, totally.
Yeah, like even more sort of like, what do you call it? Curt way of saying it is people who threaten the tax portfolio of the ruling class. What stands out to me in a lot of these definitions is the word perceived. So it's like really kind of gaslighting. It's saying that if these things are harmful to you, you're only perceiving it. It's not necessarily true. It's just something that you're yeah. Charles is pointing out, interesting that with the waning of Marxist Leninist liberation movements like the Black Panther Party, that kind of militancy has become more exclusively associated with anarchism. Absolutely, Charles. Like, it's interesting that even though, anti-communism is still I would say, a governing ideology, communism is not mentioned anywhere here. I mean, anti-capitalism is, but it's classified as anarchism, which is really interesting to see. Let's do at least just two more. Can we do, let's do the animal rights environmental violent extremists next. So I'm gonna write that down. Animal rights actually one more thing about the anarchist violent extremists is that what's screaming out to me with the word when they talk about anarchists is all of the is what they call Antifa as well, is like basically all the people who are out in the streets protesting against the police. It's like anarchist violent extremists is going to just especially be one of the things that they really streets against, the murder of Black people by law enforcement, because they perceive the police as harmful to society. Okay, but let's do animal rights and environmental extremists. Here I'll read out loud the definition. DVEs, domestic violent extremists, seeking to end or mitigate perceived cruelty, harm, or exploitation of animals, or perceived exploitation or destruction of natural resources and the environment. So please put in the chat either what stands out to you in that little blurb, or you can do a translation of it into your own language. So we have one comment says, all of Silver Lake. What stands out to you in that little paragraph or in the little sentence, or how would you do a little translation of it into your own words? DVEs seeking to end, here's Charles saying, comment on the previous two categories. Black anti-fascists are likely to be labeled as racially or ethnically motivated DVEs, and white ones as anarchist DVEs, perpetuating the same artificial divide as the outside agitator narrative. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, in fact, the one of the people that was targeted for being a quote unquote Black identity extremist, possibly the first one, Rakem Bolegun. I always pronounce his name wrong, I'm sorry. He was targeted for anti-police Facebook posts, and he was targeted as a Black identity extremist. Meanwhile, as you were saying, yeah, white protesters are targeted as anarchists. Absolutely. So going back to the animal rights and environmental violent extremists, I'm going to read out loud the paragraph one more time. Domestic violent extremists seeking to end or mitigate perceived cruelty, harm, or exploitation of animals, or perceived exploitation or destruction of natural resources and the environment. Selena's saying it's the revamped Black identity extremism classification. Oh, the racially motivated one. Yeah. Huh. Steve is pointing out the EPA would fall into that category because they're seeking to at least mitigate the destruction of natural resources. Yeah, I guess people who recycle. Now that the UN, another comment from the chat, now that the UN IPCC says that there are direct connections between climate change and the extreme deadly weather events we see, is it still just perceived? Absolutely. Well, I mean, according to Homeland's DHS, it is. And then finally, let's just do one last one. Militia violent extremists. I'm gonna write that in the chat. Militia violent extremists. Domestic violent extremists who take overt steps to violently resist or facilitate the overthrow of the US government in support of their belief that the US government is purposely exceeding its constitutional authority and is trying to establish a totalitarian regime. Oppose many federal and state laws and regulations, particularly those related to firearms ownership. And I just wanted to quickly say, as we look at this definition, that the Biden administration's own DHS pamphlet that they released that discussed all these different categories said that under militia violent extremists, they were specifically also categorizing what they called Puerto Rican national extremists, who are people who are trying to achieve the independence of Puerto Rico. Sydney is putting in a translation, the NRA. Absolutely, the National Rifle Association. And Charles is saying, what about people who think the government's constitutional authority is already illegitimate or totalitarian? I'll just say that they're in the right place right now. My translation of what the state is saying is, guns are great as long as we have them and you don't. Or we deal them. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for participating in this. We're gonna just do one last section about what are the new changes in the structure of the DHS and what is coming out of the DHS, and finally connecting it all back to LA schools and how LA students' information ends up in the hands of DHS. which comes back to the stalker state and the information sharing environment. So this is publicly available information, the DVEs. You can just look up on Google Biden DVE or DHS DVE or something like that, and you can find this list of extremist categories. So just wanted to put that out there. Now, I think it's going to be Fatima and Celine talking about this part.
Yeah, maybe you can try to go through this super quickly so we can get to the schools part. But I mean, these new classifications of domestic violent extremists is part of the new structure that the DHS launched. So, you know, when Biden promised to end the targeted violence and terrorism prevention program, he technically did and recycled it and just renamed it. So now it's the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, and it's just it's the exact same program. They're just repeatedly renaming and trying to change the image, I think. And I think also, yeah, like I said in the chat, like the Black identity extremism, now the classification is called the racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist, but it's the exact same thing. And so I think in general, just like what can help us recognize the program, even when it goes by a different name, is looking at noticing the language around extremism, domestic terrorism, and even hate. And also just anything that asks community organizations to either partner with law enforcement or to keep an eye out for potential extremists or potential terrorists. So basically outsourcing the policing to them or deputizing like service providers or educators or whoever else, or faith leaders in the community to do that work as part of policing, and to report to different referral networks that ultimately go back to law enforcement. And then any programs that involve multidisciplinary teams, again, that involves various sectors outside of just the police, but asks them to work with police. So for example, if there's a multidisciplinary team on a campus, it could involve like, yeah, different school staff or educators and law enforcement. And of course, equating like quote unquote right wing and quote unquote left wing and right wing as the same, equating basically fascism and Nazism to social justice movements and saying that they're both quote unquote extremists. And I'll basically just, and anything that asks us to build trust with law enforcement. And just to share a little bit more about like this, this framework. Again, so now it's called the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. It still relies on profiling. It's still the same countering violent extremism framework. The priorities don't change. So they're still relying on religious, racial, and political profiling to funnel people towards law enforcement. And it still relies on the radicalization theory. So although in the very beginning of this, when this framework was first launched, they were saying things like growing a beard and wearing a hijab, for example, right, as indicators, or being too much in your culture as indicators for extremism, although it's not as explicit right now, as we can see through the new classifications. It still relies on the radicalization theory, which is the debunked idea that adoption of certain ideologies can set people on a trajectory towards violence, posits that like increased, religiosity and politicization, for example, in Muslim communities would lead to an increased threat of violence. And the radicalization theory, again, has been repeatedly debunked. So and now they're trying to also, of course, frame it as a way to fight white supremacy, which is why they're trying to say that they're fighting both left-wing and right-wing extremism. However, of course, the idea of now saying that the state is going to use this framework, or is going to use countering violent extremism to target white nationalists to expand it, is not going to actually happen. This framing directs our attention to the violence of individual actors, not as a product of white supremacist society, but as like exceptional or extreme behavior of individual racists. So it kind of pushes this idea that white supremacy is something that's individualized or interpersonal. And it kind of negates the role of the state, or the fact that the state itself is a white supremacist institution. And regardless of how they try to reframe it, it is still based on this concept of radicalization and pre-crime. And it's just going to justify the increased policing and surveillance of our communities. And it's just simply a way to expand it, actually, expand how the program will operate. And of course, the concept of terrorism in general can't be separated from its legacy. This concept has been mobilized to fuel racist policies against Black communities, against Muslim communities, against Indigenous communities for decades. So, you know, we're not asking for equal opportunity CVE, which is kind of what this framing is promoting. We're demanding the complete end of CVE, of countering violent extremism, regardless of how they're naming it, and of course, and to the DHS. So yeah, I just wanted to say that really quickly. You could go to the next slide. So right now what it's looking like is, again, they're establishing the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, which has replaced the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Program. And there's a new domestic terrorism branch now within the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Information and Analysis. And it's also listed as a national priority, like combating domestic violent extremism is now considered a national priority area. So there's going to be an expansion in budget for it. And now FEMA, for example, has to spend at least $77 million to combat it. And that, I think, doesn't include the budget already within for the center itself. And DHS is now training or expanding trainings to law enforcement and other entities in threat assessment and threat management. And I'll pass it back to Akil to talk more about how it's looking like in schools. Oh, and it's of course also decentralizing CVE. So they're trying to develop these local prevention frameworks. And I think they're going to use multidisciplinary teams pretty heavily in different locales to actually do this.
Absolutely, and just bringing us back a little bit to the Iceberg and how there was a part of the CVE grants that was focused on basically the inflicting of violence by the state. And then there was another part of it that was focused on developing and strengthening sort of just the cultural belief in these things, extremism and terrorism, as objective ideas that the state is legitimate in like targeting, and how grants can actually be for different aspects of this. There could be a grant for a professor in just studying and modeling the path to radicalization. And there could be a grant to an organization that goes and just educates kids that there's such a thing called extremism. The KKK is extreme and so is the Black Panther Party or something like that. And then there could be a grant to a city to implement CVE for, you know, so basically what I'm trying to say is it can look like potentially benign or at least not explicitly harmful thing, but it's all part of the same ecology, to borrow a framework that the Stop LAPD Spying has used for Predpol. So here we have an example. This is the FBI's own, or no, DHS's own slide. You can see their little seal at the bottom about how they organize local prevention frameworks. They have one sector of activity that's for basically the benign activities in the public sector. Okay, you're intervening with social services for youth that are considered to be like at risk. You're also doing general awareness for everybody. And then you're doing trust building, which is basically just PR for the cops, trying to get people to trust an institution that is harmful to them, in the case, for example, of the Somali youth from earlier. Then you have disruption, which is the actual instance of criminalization. And they listed as investigations and arrests. And then you have the sphere of CVE for people who've been already convicted or potentially in jail or prison. And it's correctional programming, and it's also access to prevention programs to prevent supposedly recidivism or to work on them during probation or parole. But all of this is part of this coherent ideology that's viewing certain people as a threat. So you can't just have this without these two. And when a grant looks like it's for just the NGO-led activities, we have to recognize that it's part of this larger ecosystem that includes this really harmful stuff too. I think we should skip this just because of lack of time. But this is just going a little bit more into what the FBI's own language is on, or the DHS's own languages on local prevention frameworks. And just quickly talk about threat assessment and threat management. So this is what the DHS and the FBI suggest as the way that these multidisciplinary teams surveil people. They assess basically whether the person is on a path towards a specific type of violence, and then they assess how they're going to do a coordinated plan to do either direct or indirect interventions. So assessing whether a person is going to be violent is threat assessments, and then figuring out how to manage that is threat management. These are how they think about multidisciplinary teams in concentric circles going out. This is a slide from the FBI. So they have it at the local level and then all the way out to the federal level. So houses of worship, K through 12. I don't remember what IHE is. Maybe we can all figure out at some point. And then business are all at the individual level. And then you have the FBI and DHS at the federal level, and then all these different agencies in between, including the Fusion Center at the state level. And then finally, this is just one more thing that shows this sort of intersecting relationship between how they're using these existing relationships in the community, houses of worship, social services, schools, and businesses. And they're going to refer cases of people deemed suspicious to law enforcement. This is law enforcement, mental health professionals, prosecutors, and probation and parole. And then this team is going to train everybody else in who to surveil. So this is the back and forth. This is, again, their slide and how they're planning on doing this. And then finally, just to bring it, I'm going to just go to the Los Angeles because we only have a few minutes left. The threat assessment and management team that exists in LA schools is called START, the School Threat Assessment and Response Team. And they coordinate with LAPD's threat management unit. So School Threat Assessment and Response Team is a partnership between LAUSD, law enforcement, and the Department of Mental Health. And they partner with LAPD, LA sheriffs. Oh, sorry, that is what it is. This is basically, so if you're interested in helping us figure out how this is targeting LA youth, please send us your email. You can send it to me in the chat, or you can send it to Nadia, or you can send it to Celine, and we can make sure that you're there at our working meeting next week. But basically, thank you so much, Stephanie. Basically, after a student gets referred to the School Threat Assessment and Response Team, their information, remember, if you go back to the stalker state, it gets transferred through this process. Basically, a person fills out a threat assessment form. The student, they convene a multidisciplinary team that includes a mental health professional, an officer, and an administrator. And then they do a threat assessment and threat management for this youth, and their information can end up in that fusion center where it will be forever, or it'll be exchanged with a huge number of other federal agencies. Oh, Fatima, thank you. IHE's Institutions of Higher Education. Got it. Thank you, Fatima. So this is the institution in LAUSD that is particularly responsible for the interfacing between LA's youth and these federal agencies. And this is their own data on who they have referred. Since in just one fiscal year, they received more than 5,000 calls. They referred more than 300 youth. They've done psychiatric evaluations on 173, and they've done more than 64 trainings. So by the way, this START is considered a model for the rest of the country. It was created based on a school shooter narrative, the idea that law enforcement in schools is there to prevent school shooters, which, we can see in LA that that's absolutely not the case, because most school shooters are white and law enforcement is targeting youth of color. It's just one easy way to see that that's not the reason that they're there. And then department, so basically the START is this partnership there. They've existed since 2009. Let me see if I can zoom ahead, because we only have a couple of moments left. Oh, the last thing I wanted to share about START is that when they evaluated CVE in LA, 2 researchers, academics, suggested that START, its existing infrastructure, was the best place to implement CVE because it already has this larger structure and it's tied to the city. But not only that, but because CVE as a program has a bad rap, basically, people know that it's a bad thing. So to implement CVE style policing, within ongoing structures in LA is what they suggested would be better than implementing it as a standalone program, which can result in something like what happened in Boston, where both people in Boston and around the country knew this is a really fucked up program, so they organized to end it. And we did that with CVE in LA, but we know that it's continuing on as a style of policing under different names, which is what makes it harder to fight. But that's why we're here, to basically learn about how the Hydra is evolving so we can continue to fight it. So it's 8 right now. I just wanted to tell everybody before we close and do announcements that our working meeting is next Wednesday at 6 p.m. That's Wednesday, the 18th of August. And I see one person already emailed us, and we really hope that person can be there on the 18th at 6 p.m. If you want to come, please email us your email address and we'll get you the Zoom info. It's next Wednesday at 6. Next Wednesday, the 18th at 6 p.m. And we'll be building power and organizing to try to confront and dismantle these programs. Awesome. Sydney, you're already going to be invited.
Yeah, can I quickly show something?
Absolutely. So, and also if you have any announcements after that.
So for folks who are doing tenant organizing and anti-gentrification work, this is, you were talking about anarchist extremists, their language. This is an old memo from 2013 that the Department of Homeland Security released about people who are against gentrification. And I share this just to read this, you know, the definition of how they do that. For the purposes of this analysis, DHS understands anarchist extremist meaning of gentrification to mean the buying and renovation of houses and stores in deteriorated urban neighborhoods by upper or middle income persons, thus improving property values, but often displacing low income families and small businesses. Anarchist extremists oppose gentrification because they believe it is oppressive and part of a greater class war led by the privileged in society against lower income and working class individuals. So, and they go on to, it's also on our website as well, and they go on to call for people that if they see any activity of anti-gentrification to file a suspicious activity report. So, I mean, this is where fusion centers come in and all of that. I just wanted to kind of throw that in there.
Absolutely, Hamid. It all comes together. Back with the very first things, fusion centers and suspicious activity reporting. So, Hamid, if you have any announcements, I'm just going to type in the details for the next meeting in the chat too right now.
Yeah, so one quick announcement, our next Tuesday, the 17th, the webinar is our general meeting, and that's going to be, we're going to be circling back to COVID as to what our team that has been doing and monitoring public health surveillance and things like that, Professor and Dr. Bita Amani, Jamie Garcia, Mina Sharif, and some of the other folks are going to be joining us. And that webinar is going to be committed to kind of sharing with us what the current situation is and what's going on. And that's next Tuesday, the 17th at 6 o'clock.
Awesome. You can come to that one on Tuesday at 6 p.m. and then on Wednesday, you can join us for our working meeting. And then you have your social life all figured out for next week. All right, everybody, we're over time. Thank you so much for sticking around. Make sure that you send me your email before you go if you want to come next week. Thank you.